Hey guys, I hope you had a good week. Um, so today we are discussing one of my favorite poets, E. E. Cummings. Let's start, like normal, with Cummings' background. He was born in 1894 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He grew up in a middle-class environment and attended Harvard University. He wrote poetry from the time he was 8. I'm going to take a minute and ask you to think about that. Isn't it pretty amazing that he wrote poetry from the time he was 8? I would love to see some of those poems that he wrote as a kid. Anyway, back to Cummings. He published a poetry anthology in 1917 with some of his friends from Harvard, appropriately titled 8 Harvard Poets. Cummings was also a visual artist. This is very important for our study of Cummings, as you will see when you get to class. Let's talk now about the place Cummings has in American poetry. This comes out of the book I have here. It's called The Cambridge Introduction to 20th Century American Poetry by Christopher Beach. There you go. This book is very, very helpful, you guys. It can be found in the Southeastern Library or on Amazon. I believe you can also get it for Kindle if you want. Anyway, here's what Beach has to say about Cummings. Yet, despite the brilliant successes of his early career, Cummings does not figure prominently in most literary histories of the modernist period. Cummings's poems, while they achieved more popularity among general readers than those of any 20th century American poet other than Frost, have gradually fallen out of the central canon of American modernism. Though poems such as Buffalo Bills, Oh Sweet Spontaneous, In Just, and Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town remain standard anthology pieces, it is increasingly rare to see Cummings cited as a primary force in 20th century American poetry. Excuse me, that was 20th century poetry, not 20th century American poetry. So basically, what Beach is saying here is that Cummings was really popular when he started to produce his poetry, but as time went on, he kind of fell out of popularity. He is not talked about today as much as he once was, which personally I think is kind of tragic. But why is Cummings not seen as important? Beach does give a few different reasons for this. The first is that the ideas of Cummings, that he expressed in his poetry were not very complex. Second is that Cummings didn't grow as a poet like other modernists did. Finally, Beach says that the ideas presented in Cummings' poetry didn't connect to a larger whole, so they're disconnected. Think about this before we get to class. How about the style of Cummings' poetry? If you've already read Cummings, you've probably seen this, but I still think it's important to go over it anyway. When we get to class, I definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts on how the poems looked. But again, I think Beach says it best in the Cambridge Introduction book. He says, the Cummings' poets are immediately recognizable with their eccentric use of typography, punctuation, syntax, and visual form. I love the way Beach seems to be trying to be nice here when he says that Cummings' style is eccentric. Maybe it's just me, but I've always kind of equated eccentric with crazy. By the way, I'm sorry if you guys can see my breath. I'm recording outside and it's pretty cold. It's late and I didn't want to wake up my roommate. Anyway, just look at your anthology for evidence of this style. The poems are all over the place in terms of sentence structure and how they look on the page. I want to know, when we get to class, if this made it easier or harder for you to read Cummings, and for either distinction, tell me why. Okay, next question. What did Cummings write about? Beach says that Cummings is best known as a lyric poet who wrote on themes of love and nature, but he was also one of the most effective poetic satirists, sorry, I've always had trouble saying that word, of his age, often using his poems as skillful critiques of government policies and the ills of an overly consumeristic society. So Cummings seems concerned with the government and the society that he lives in. The anthology's introduction says that Cummings was skeptical about religious faith but had an almost transcendentalizing, say that 3 times fast, faith in human beings. So Cummings placed a high faith in human beings. When we get to class, I want to know if any of you see these specific attributes in Cummings' poetry. All right, guys, that is it for this week. Email me if you have any questions about Cummings' poetry before we get to class. Also, on a housekeeping note here, I want you guys to start thinking about your final projects. Look at the details in the syllabus. If you have any questions, you can call me, you can email me, you can flag me down on campus, whatever you need to do. Let me know. I will see you in class.